Ryan didn't fire me with anger. He fired me like he was deleting a file. It was just after 8. The office still smelled like burnt espresso and oat milk, and I was standing by the break room machine when Dominic Valls, the founder's son and the newly appointed CEO, walked in. No good morning. No smile. Just that look people reserve for furniture they plan to replace. Adriana, he said, already turning away. My office. Now. He didn't wait for an answer. My name is Adriana Vale. I'm 41 years old. I've spent the last 11 years building the strategic accounts function here quietly, relentlessly, until my team became the reason our biggest clients stayed during every leadership wobble and every market panic. Dominic didn't ask what I was working on. He didn't ask about Kingswell. He didn't ask anything at all. When I stepped into his office, the first thing I noticed wasn't him. It was the setup. No water on the table. No, the blinds angled down like the room had been prepared to hide a mess. And on the corner of his desk, half covered by his laptop, was a printed agenda titled Account Transition Kingswell with a calendar time stamped for later that morning. He'd scheduled my replacement meeting before he even spoke to me. Dominic didn't sit. You're fired, he said. Voice flat. We don't need lazy people like you dragging this place down. For a second, my body did the old reflex heat rising, throat tightening, 1,000 hours of overtime demanding to be acknowledged. Then I saw another detail, a second sheet. Already signed. Already ready. Not a performance write-up. Not a warning. A clean termination memo with boxes ticked like this was routine. No compliance officer in the room. No HR witness at the door. Just the CEO's son playing judge. I blinked once. Excuse me, you heard me, he said, flipping through papers like he was deciding lunch. Collect your things, effective immediately. Outside his glass wall. My team sat in that familiar hush that happens when people sense a storm but don't know where it will land. So, a few heads lifted as I walked out. Someone started to stand. I gave them a subtle shake of my head. Don't feed the fire. At my desk, my fingers moved on autopilot, laptop shut, badge unclipped. The dark blue contract portfolio slid into my bag like it weighed nothing. I didn't slam drawers. I didn't cry in the elevator. I didn't give Dominic the scene he was trying to provoke. I smiled politely on the way out. And in that moment, I realized what he was really doing, that he wasn't just firing me. He was erasing me from the story of what this company was about to become. Because Kingswell, our largest, most fragile negotiation, was scheduled to finalize within 48 hours. And the transition invite I'd seen on his desk wasn't for someday. It was for today. As I stepped into the cold morning air and the doors sealed behind me, my phone stayed silent. No apology. No explanation. No official notice beyond the memo he'd waved like a weapon. Just the city moving on like nothing happened. And as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. Because if Dominic hadn't even read the Kingswell contract before he fired me, what exactly had he just triggered inside it? If someone removes you without reading the system you built, do you fight? Or do you let the structure answer for you? I didn't build my career on charisma. I built it on containment. For 11 years. I was the person executives called when something was quietly bleeding money behind the scenes. I negotiated 9-figure renewals without headlines. I rebuilt client trust after mergers that should have collapsed. I absorbed tension so the board could sleep at night and the founder could sell stability to investors. Kingswell wasn't just another account. It was a $1.3 billion cross-border infrastructure agreement that took 6 months of cultural alignment, regulatory mapping, and risk modeling to structure. Their CEO valued one thing above all else: consistency of representation. He didn't want rotating executives or flashy handoffs. He wanted one accountable negotiator. That mattered more than most people understood. 3 years ago, after a disastrous acquisition nearly cost us a strategic client, I insisted on a structural safeguard in our high-value contracts. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Clause 14.2 sold authorized negotiator. It stated that during active negotiation windows, only the designated executive me could legally represent the company. Removal of that executive would trigger a temporary suspension of negotiation authority and automatic compliance review, not as leverage, as protection. At the time, Some called it excessive. Victor Hale signed it anyway. Stability builds trust, he'd said. If you're the one holding the relationship, then the contract should reflect that. Kingswell agreed. In writing, the clause wasn't about ego. It wasn't about ownership. It was about preventing exactly what had just happened, impulsive authority disrupting institutional continuity. When Dominic fired me that morning, he didn't just remove a director. He removed the legally designated negotiator 48 hours before closing, which meant one thing. If he had actually read the contract, he would have known the deal couldn't move without my written authorization. But Dominic didn't read structures, then he read headlines. And somewhere inside that leather portfolio sitting on my kitchen counter, Clause 14.2 was waiting patiently. Have you ever built a safeguard for a mistake someone arrogant hasn't made yet? Dominic Velez didn't walk into the company. He entered it like a campaign, town hall, slide deck, words like modernization, velocity, lean leadership. He was 30, sharp-suited, and visibly determined to prove he wasn't just the founder's son. The board watched him the way investors watch a volatile stock, hopeful, cautious. I watched him skim. In his first executive meeting, he flipped through a summary binder instead of the full agreements. He asked for streamlined reporting. He questioned why certain clients required legacy continuity structures. That was his phrase. Why is one person attached to a deal he'd asked? Glancing at the Kingswell file without opening it? That's inefficient. It's contractual, I replied evenly. Continuity was a negotiated condition. He tapped the cover with 2 fingers. We're moving into a new era. No one is indispensable. There it was. Not cruelty, not incompetence, impatience. He believed disruption was leadership, that removing long-standing executives would signal strength, that speed equaled authority. What he didn't see was the architecture beneath what he called legacy. Kingswell wasn't a sales pipeline. It was a geopolitical alignment, a multilingual negotiation structured around regulatory assurances and personal credibility. Their CEO didn't trust brands. He trusted faces, specifically mine. Dominic didn't challenge the clause directly. He didn't ask compliance to review it. He didn't schedule legal counsel to walk through exposure. He assumed removal meant replacement. And the morning he fired me, he never once asked Meredith from compliance to sit in, that he never once opened Clause 14.2. He thought he was eliminating friction. He didn't realize he was activating it. When ambition outruns comprehension, what breaks first, people? Or the contracts holding everything together? By 9 the next morning, the silence broke. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in months. Victor Hale. I just walked into the office, he said without greeting. His voice wasn't angry, it was tight, controlled. Why did you pack up your desk? Your CEO terminated me, I replied calmly. A pause. Paper shuffling. A chair scraping against hardwood. He what? There are moments in corporate life when reality shifts, not because someone shouts, but because someone reads. Did he copy compliance? Victor asked. No. Another silence. Longer this time. We have Kingswell at 11, he muttered. More to himself than to me. He can't. I heard a drawer open. More paper. Then a sharp exhale. Adriana, did he read Clause 14.2 before removing you? My gaze moved instinctively to the dark blue portfolio on my kitchen counter. I doubt it. The line went quiet except for the faint rustle of documents being flipped faster now. A different voice joined faintly in the background, Meredith Shaw from compliance. Sir, if the designated negotiator is removed during an active negotiation window, authority is automatically suspended pending board review. Suspended, not transferred. Not reassigned, suspended. Victor came back on the line. There's a 24-hour freeze embedded, and a 72-hour compliance escalation window. This triggers oversight? Yes, I said. That was the point. Another pause. He wasn't speaking as a father now. He was calculating as a chairman. If Kingswell's legal team runs a continuity check this morning, he said slowly, they'll flag the authority gap and freeze the deal. I finished. Somewhere in that executive suite, someone was opening the full contract for the first time. Because paper trails don't argue. They wait. What happens when authority is revoked, but the contract refuses to cooperate? At 10:07 a.m., Dominic made it official. The termination memo digitally signed, time-stamped, and circulated to HR, finance, and executive leadership stated that I was removed effective immediately from all strategic accounts, including Kingswell. It was clean, decisive, public, and irreversible. At 10:12 a.m., compliance flagged the contract. At 10:16 a.m., Meredith Shaw forwarded a system-generated notice to the executive group, subject authority suspension. Kingswell Holdings Clause 14.2, triggered per contractual provision 14A's. 2. Removal of the sole authorized negotiator during an active negotiation window initiates immediate 24-hour negotiation freeze, 72-hour compliance review, automatic escalation to Board Oversight Committee. No alternative representative may act on behalf of the company until review is complete. At 10:21 a.m., Kingswell's legal department requested clarification on continuity of representation. By 10:24 a.m., the $1.3 billion negotiation was frozen. I wasn't in the building, but I could picture it. Dominic standing at the head of the boardroom table, slide deck ready, transition plan prepared, confidence intact until Meredith entered with printed pages and placed them in front of him. "Did you review clause 14.2 before signing this?" she would have asked. He would have skimmed, then read, then reread, because the clause didn't just protect my role. It protected the client's right to refuse misrepresented authority. If Kingswell believed the company had attempted to negotiate without its designated executive, they could invoke reputational misalignment review and apply delay penalties. Victor called me at 10:31. "What did you do?" he asked, but not accusingly. "I installed a safeguard 3 years ago," I said, "for exactly this scenario." He signed the memo without legal review. "Yes." Silence, then was quietly, "The board's been notified." That was the moment it shifted, not when I was fired. Not when Dominic insulted me, but when his signature triggered oversight beyond his control. Activation doesn't feel dramatic. It feels procedural. A click, a timestamp, a clause waking up, and somewhere inside that executive chamber, Dominic realized he hadn't removed a director. He had suspended his own authority. Have you ever watched someone pull a trigger only to realize the structure was already aimed back at them at 10:42 a.m.? My phone started vibrating. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. Dominic, then HR, then an internal extension I didn't recognize, then Victor again. I let it ring. For the first time in 11 years, I wasn't the one rushing into damage control. I was sitting at my kitchen table, watching sunlight slide across the dark blue leather portfolio, while inside the office, the architecture I built was recalibrating without me. Inside the executive suite? Dominic's tone had changed. "It's procedural," he insisted. "We can assign a new negotiator." Meredith didn't argue. She rarely did. "You can't," she replied evenly. Clause 14.2 requires written authorization from the designated executive or a completed compliance review. Neither exists. The deal can't freeze over one person. It just did. Across the table, Victor Hale wasn't speaking. He was reading the contract line by line, the full version this time, not the summary. The board notification had already been sent. Oversight Committee copied automatically. This was no longer an internal disagreement. It was governance. My phone buzzed again. "Victor," I answered this time. "Adriana," he said carefully. "Kingswell's legal team has paused the signing window. They want confirmation of representation continuity." I expected that. A pause. "Will you come in?" There it was, not an apology, a negotiation. "If I return," I said calmly, "it will be under written autonomy, direct reporting to you for this account. No interference from Dominic." Silence stretched on the line. "Send me your conditions," he said finally. When I hung up, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. Because this wasn't about reclaiming a position. It was about deciding whether structure still mattered inside that building. Is returning a sign of weakness or leverage when the system has already chosen your side? By 1:05 p.m., the executive boardroom was sealed, not ceremonially, logistically. Meredith sat to Victor's right with a printed compliance report. 2 board members had dialed in remotely. Kingswell's legal liaison was on speaker. Waiting for clarification, Dominic stood at the head of the table, jaw tight, sleeves rolled up like effort could override structure. I took the seat opposite him. No one commented on my return. The contract did that for them. Layer 1 operational collapse. Meredith began. As of 10:16 a.m., Clause 14.2 triggered authority suspension. Kingswell has invoked the 24-hour freeze pending continuity confirmation. On speaker, Kingswell's counsel added, "We require assurance that designated representation remains intact. Until then, signing is paused." Paused. Not delayed by weather. Not delayed by negotiation terms. Paused by governance instability. The room felt smaller. Dominic leaned forward. "We can assign interim authority. This is internal." "No," Kingswell replied evenly. "Your agreement specifies otherwise. Operational control gone. Layer 2, financial/legal exigure." Meredith slid a second document across the table. Section 9.4, delay liability. If continuity failure results from internal executive action, financial exposure applies. Victor read the line aloud. His voice didn't rise. Projected exposure if Kingswell withdraws up to $75 million in reputational and delay penalties? Meredith answered. Plus long-term revenue loss. Dominic's composure fractured. This is absurd. Over a personnel decision? It's not a personnel decision, I said calmly. It's a contractual breach of continuity. The board member on the screen spoke for the first time. "Dominic, did you review clause 14.2 before signing the termination silence?" Then I reviewed the executive summary. That wasn't the question. Financial risk was no longer theoretical. It was quantified. Layer 3, reputation reversal. Victor finally stood. "When you removed Adriana without compliance review, you didn't just restructure a department," he said quietly. "You triggered board oversight." He turned to the remote members. "I'm exercising chairman authority, effective immediately. Negotiation authority for Kingswell returns to Adriana Vale under direct reporting to me." Dominic's head snapped toward him. "You're overriding the CEO. I'm protecting the company." The shift was visible, not loud, not theatrical, just final. Dominic was still technically CEO, but in that room, authority had moved. Kingswell's counsel cleared his throat. "If designated representation is restored in writing, we are prepared to proceed tomorrow." Victor nodded. "It will be done." The call ended. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Dominic remained standing at the head of the table, but no one was looking at him anymore. Structure had answered. And for the first time since he walked into the company like a campaign, Dominic understood something critical. Titles can be inherited. Authority cannot. When power is challenged in public, what survives ego or structure? Kingswell signed the next morning. No applause, no press. Just controlled signatures. A reaffirmation of continuity. And a brief nod from their legal counsel that said more than any congratulatory email could. Operational stability restored. Financial exposure neutralized. But inside the building, nothing felt settled. Dominic was still CEO. His title hadn't changed. His office hadn't moved. His access card still opened every secured floor. The board had imposed temporary oversight on high-value contracts. Yes, but oversight is not removal. It's supervision. During the signing, Dominic didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. He reviewed his phone, posture rigid, as if the outcome were administrative rather than existential. That worried me more than anger would have. After Kingswell's delegation left, Victor asked me to remain. "You handled that with restraint," he said. "I handled it with documentation," I replied. He nodded once. "The board is initiating a limited internal governance review. It's procedural." There it was again. Procedural. Across the office floor, small shifts began. Compliance was suddenly CCD on budget approvals that once moved quietly. HR requested written clarifications on routine changes. A junior associate hesitated before handing me a report, his eyes flicking, just briefly, toward Dominic's office. Authority had grown witnesses. That afternoon, Clara stopped by. "People think this is over," she said softly. "It isn't." I answered. Dominic wasn't reckless anymore, and he was contained. Contained people calculate. He had been publicly corrected, restricted, overridden. Men who mistake control for competence don't accept correction as closure. They reinterpret it as temporary. And temporary is something they believe can be fixed. When the system steps in to restrain power, does it resolve the conflict or just push it underground? The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was a reimbursement delay. An expensive submission from the Kingswell trip flagged for insufficient documentation. That had never happened before. I resubmitted it with receipts attached. It was flagged again. Then an email surfaced. Sent from my address at 11:48 p.m. 2 nights earlier. It contained outdated pricing terms and was forwarded to one of our overseas partners. The partner, fortunately, called me directly. Adriana. I assume this was a draft, he asked carefully. It wasn't mine. I replied, IT ran a trace. The message originated from a shared workstation near the executive corridor. Credentials entered manually. No external breach. Internal. 2 days later, HR notified me of a complaint alleging I had created a hostile post-incident work environment and was undermining executive leadership. Anonymous, but oddly specific. This wasn't anger. It was strategy. If Dominic couldn't override the contract, he would erode credibility instead. Slow reputational corrosion. Enough friction to make the board question whether restoring me had been the right call. I didn't confront him. I documented every flagged expense, every anomalous login, every delayed approval. I forwarded them to David Lynn, head of internal audit, with timestamps and access logs attached. 3 days later, I was called into the audit committee's temporary review room. David didn't waste time. We traced the login attempts. He said, multiple instances tied to executive-level access chains, including your fabricated email. He rotated the monitor toward me. Digital breadcrumbs, timestamps aligned with Dominic's assistant's credentials, access overlap windows, pattern repetition. Is this enough, I asked, for suspension pending misconduct review? David said evenly, yes, that afternoon. The board reconvened. Dominic arrived late, and he didn't look at me this time. He looked at the evidence, and for the second time in less than a week, structure, not emotion, answered. When someone shifts from arrogance to sabotage, how do you respond without becoming like them? Dominic's suspension was announced the following Monday. No dramatic memo, no public scandal, just a concise internal notice citing executive-level governance violations and internal misconduct pending final board determination. 3 days later, it became permanent. Termination, no press release, no litigation headlines. The board classified it as a contained governance matter. Victor signed the final paperwork himself. I expected to feel victorious. I didn't. I felt something quieter, like finishing a marathon you never meant to run. The audit findings were clear coordinated misuse of internal access, fabricated correspondence, manipulation of reporting channels, not catastrophic crimes. Just enough corrosion to destabilize trust. Enough to justify removal. But structure extracts its own cost. During the suspension window, Kingswell's legal team requested additional assurances before finalizing long-term expansion for 48 hours. My credibility, not Dominic's, was under scrutiny. They signed. But the hesitation was real. An external executive offer I had been considering quietly withdrew during the chaos. We're moving in a different direction, the recruiter wrote. Victor and I never returned to how we were before. Professional, respectful. But something personal had closed. Power struggles leave residue. The day my promotion was formalized, Executive Director of Strategic Strategy, reporting directly to the chairman. I moved into a new office overlooking the river. I didn't bring many things, just the dark blue leather portfolio. Inside it was the Kingswell Agreement, now fully executed. I removed the contract and placed a framed copy on the wall open not to my signature, but to Clause 14.2. The safeguard, not as a trophy. As a reminder, authority without diligence is sabotage, and boundaries are not revenge, they're structure. What safeguard have you built that others still underestimate? Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with your perspective. We read every one. 10 minutes after my boss poured wine on me in front of everyone, the $2 billion investor stopped smiling. The room had laughed. I did not react. I made one call. By the time I stepped out of the ballroom, he was walking beside me instead of standing next to her. I remember how quiet the hallway felt compared to the noise we had just left behind. My phone was still in my hand. I was not shaking, which surprised me that I thought I would be. The investor's assistant was already on another call, speaking in a low, controlled voice about a temporary review of the first funding tranche. No one was shouting. That is what people misunderstand about moments like this. They think power shifts loudly. 2 hours earlier, everything had been steady. My name is Delaney Mercer. I am 39 years old, And at the time, I was the chief strategy officer of Hargrove Biotech in Chicago. I had spent the last 18 months structuring a $2 billion growth investment with a private equity firm based in New York. The agreement was not just about capital. It was built around governance safeguards that I insisted on during negotiations. I believed in protecting the company from instability, even if it made leadership uncomfortable. I did not think I would need those protections for myself. The gala at the Langham was meant to celebrate the signing. I had reviewed the final compliance language that afternoon in my office overlooking the river, double-checking the executive conduct clause one more time. I told myself it was routine diligence in hindsight. I may have already sensed something fragile in the way our chief executive, Callista Hargrove, had been acting in the weeks leading up to the event. Callista liked public moments. She liked being seen as the architect of the deal. I understood that dynamic and accepted it. Titles mattered differently to different people. I cared more about structure than spotlight when the live stream cameras were positioned near the stage. I noticed one of them still recording as guests moved around. I considered mentioning it to the events team, but I let it go. It did not seem important at the time. The first glass of wine was poured about 15 minutes into the reception. The second one did not land in a glass. It landed on me, and that is where everything truly began. The wine was still drying on my jacket when I thought back to the first meeting I had with Thomas Avery, the lead partner from the investment firm. That meeting had taken place 9 months earlier in a glass conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. He had already declined us once. We like the science, he told me then, reviewing his notes without looking up. We don't like the volatility at the top. He meant Callista, though he never used her name. At that time, she had dismissed his hesitation as arrogance from New York. I understood it differently. Investors do not fear ambition. They fear unpredictability. After that rejection, I restructured the entire proposal. I redesigned the compliance framework so executive conduct was not treated as a personal matter, but as a financial risk variable. I drafted what became the executive conduct and reputational risk clause myself. It allowed the investor to pause funding if documented leadership behavior created material governance exposure. It was narrow, precise, and tied to objective review standards. I thought of it as insulation. When Thomas and I reviewed the final draft months later, he paused at that section. If leadership destabilizes this company, he said quietly, I need to know who steadies it. I met his eyes across the table. Structure steadies it. He held my gaze a moment longer than necessary. And if the structure fails, then you reassess before capital compounds the damage. That was the first time he nodded without reservation. Publicly. Callista took credit for restoring negotiations. She described the revised deal as proof of her resilience. I did not challenge that narrative when I had no interest in public credit. I cared about enforceable language. Looking back, I understand something I did not fully admit then. I built those protections because I'd already seen small fractures in how she handled pressure. Sharp comments in meetings, impulsive decisions justified as confidence. I documented what I could. I assumed we would never need the clause in a social setting. Tonight proved otherwise. Callista had been moving through the room with practiced ease, greeting board members and donors as if the evening existed entirely for her. Up close, I could see the flush in her cheeks and the extra brightness in her eyes. She handled attention well, but she did not handle sharing it. When Thomas approached us near the stage, she slipped her arm through his as though the investment were already secured beyond question. This partnership proves bold leadership wins, she declared, lifting her glass slightly, not cautious hesitation. Thomas gave a measured smile. Bold leadership still answers to structure. She laughed lightly, though there was an edge to it. Structure follows vision. I felt the shift before anyone else did. I had seen that tone in internal meetings when she felt challenged. One of the event coordinators gestured toward a camera. Callista glanced briefly, then away. We're off broadcast. Right, she asked without waiting for confirmation. The coordinator hesitated. I believe so. She turned back to me, eyes narrowing just enough to register. You've been quiet tonight, Delaney. I've said what needed to be said, I replied evenly. Have you? She swirled the wine in her glass. Sometimes people confuse drafting paperwork with leading. Thomas watched the exchange without intervening. Callista stepped closer. Know your place. The wine tipped forward before I registered the motion. It spread across my shoulder and down the front of my jacket. A few gasps broke out, followed quickly by nervous laughter. Someone near the back actually clapped, thinking it was some kind of joke. Thomas did not move. I did not reach for a napkin right away. I met her eyes instead. There was a split second where she expected anger. I gave her none. Oh, she added, feigning surprise. I didn't realize how close you were. The room continued laughing, but the investor was no longer smiling. I stepped away from the crowd and out onto the balcony, closing the door behind me. The noise softened immediately. I could still hear laughter inside. Thinner now, less certain. I took a slow breath and looked down at the dark water below. It felt steady. I needed that. My phone was already in my hand, and I had not planned to use it tonight. If I filed a formal governance breach report, the first funding tranche could be suspended. That would trigger market speculation before the deal was even operational. The board would call an emergency meeting, but Callista would know it came from me. If I stayed silent, I would be protecting someone who had already ignored documented conduct warnings. I had archived those emails for a reason. I had kept the HR memo from 3 months ago recommending executive coaching after a separate incident with a department head. I told myself at the time that documentation was insurance. I did not expect to collect on it. My thumb hovered over the contact for Thomas's legal liaison. $2 billion, and that number had weight. It meant expanded research, hiring, stability for hundreds of employees. It also meant leverage concentrated in the wrong hands if leadership volatility continued. My hand trembled once before it steadied. I felt embarrassed by that small shake, though no one could see it. I am not immune to pressure. I just don't let it make decisions for me. I typed a short message requesting an immediate compliance review call and attached the archived documentation along with a live stream timestamp. I kept the language clinical. No accusations, no emotion. When the reply came through, it was brief, understood, initiating review. I knew then that whatever happened next would not be reversible. The call connected within 3 minutes. On the screen were Thomas and his firm's general counsel, Rebecca Lynn, whom I had worked with throughout negotiations. Her expression was neutral, which I appreciated. Delaney, Rebecca began, we received your submission. Before we proceed, confirm this is a formal governance notification. It is, I answered. I am invoking the Executive Conduct and Reputational Risk Clause under Section 14. Subsection 3. Thomas leaned back slightly. Walk us through your reasoning. The incident was public, documented, and streamed internally. I explained, it reflects a pattern. I have attached 2 prior written warnings and the HR memorandum recommending executive conduct intervention from March. Rebecca scrolled through the files. You're aware this triggers an automatic review of the first funding tranche. I am. Thomas studied me. If we suspend, the market will interpret that as instability. The instability is already visible. I replied. This review contains it. Ignoring it compounds it. Silence held for a few seconds. I could hear muted music from inside through the balcony door behind me. Rebecca spoke first. Under the clause, we are obligated to initiate independent governance review. Funding tranche 1 will enter temporary suspension pending findings. This is procedural, Thomas added, more quietly. You understand the personal implications. Yes, he did not press further. All right, we'll notify our internal committee immediately. When the call ended, I felt a shift that was not dramatic, but decisive. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing had exploded. A mechanism I helped build had simply activated. I returned inside. The laughter had faded into scattered conversations. Callista was at the bar, retelling the incident as if it were harmless theater. She caught my eye briefly and smiled in a way that suggested control. Within minutes, Thomas's assistant approached her and requested a private word. I stayed where I was. I did not need to follow. The report was no longer mine alone. Thomas and Rebecca returned to the main floor together. They did not look hurried. That alone shifted the mood around them. Conversations thinned as people sensed something formal was about to happen. Callista greeted them with a bright expression. Everything settled. Thomas did not smile this time. We are invoking the executive conduct clause pending independent governance review. The air changed. A few guests stopped mid-sentence. Callista gave a short laugh. Surely this is unnecessary. It was a harmless moment, Rebecca answered evenly. The clause does not assess intent. It assesses exposure. There's no exposure, Callista insisted. This deal is $2 billion. You wouldn't jeopardize that over a social misunderstanding. Thomas held her gaze. We are not jeopardizing it. We are protecting it. She glanced at me for the first time since the spill. The smile disappeared. Did you escalate this? I kept my voice steady. I submitted documentation. You blindsided your own leadership. I followed the framework we agreed to. That landed harder than I expected. Thomas shifted slightly toward me. Delaney, walk with me. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply turned toward the exit. For a brief moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the decision, but because I understood what it would look like. Then I stepped forward. As we moved through the ballroom, phones were already lifting discreetly. Callista remained near the stage, speaking quickly to a board member, trying to contain something that was no longer hers to manage. Outside the main doors, Thomas spoke quietly. This is a review, not a withdrawal. I understand. You may face consequences internally. I understand that too. We continued down the hallway together. The funding had not disappeared. It had shifted position. By 8 a.m., we were forced to file a Form 8K disclosing the provisional suspension of the anchor funding tranche. The market didn't react to the wine. It reacted to the filing. Our stock opened down 10% as algorithms triggered sell-offs on the news of a funding contingency and governance review uncertainty. No one mentioned wine. Markets rarely care about the gesture. They care about what it signals. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. I received the calendar invitation at 8:12 a.m., marked mandatory. At 9:30, Callista called my direct line. What exactly did you think would happen? She demanded without greeting. I expected the clause to activate a review. I answered. You embarrassed this company. The review protects it. She exhaled sharply. You've frozen $2 billion in funding. Temporarily, I corrected. Pending independent assessment. You could have handled this internally. We did handle it internally. 3 times. There was a pause. You're overstepping. I'm operating within the agreement you approved. Her tone shifted from anger to something colder. The board won't tolerate this kind of instability. The board approved the clause. That doesn't mean they'll side with you. I considered that carefully. This isn't about sides. It feels personal. It isn't. Silence again. Longer this time. Fix this, she repeated. This is the fix. I replied quietly. She ended the call without another word. By 10:15, I received 2 messages from board members requesting background documentation. One of them, Daniel Cho, wrote, "We need clarity before conclusions." That was as close to support as anyone was willing to offer publicly. I understood the risk. Triggering a review could be reframed as destabilizing leadership. If the board chose optics over structure, I could be the easiest variable to remove. But the mechanism was already in motion. All I could do now was stand behind it. The independent review moved faster than most internal processes ever did. Within 4 days, the external governance firm had requested archived correspondence, HR documentation, and prior board minutes. Nothing in their tone suggested outrage. It was methodical. At the emergency session, Rebecca from the investors firm joined remotely. Thomas remained silent for most of it. The review chair began plainly. We have identified 3 prior executive conduct complaints within the past 18 months. Callista shifted in her seat. All resolved, documented. Yes, the chair responded. Corrected. No. A summary appeared on the screen, an incident with a senior researcher during a grant negotiation. A reprimand issued privately but not recorded formally. A recommendation for executive coaching that was declined. Daniel Cho, who had messaged me earlier in the week, spoke up. I flagged reputational exposure last quarter. Callista turned toward him. You mentioned optics, not risk. Optics become risk when capital is involved, Daniel replied evenly. Rebecca leaned forward slightly on screen. The wine incident was not assessed in isolation. It confirmed a pattern of volatility under public pressure. Callista's voice tightened. You're characterizing leadership. We're evaluating governance, Rebecca corrected. There's a difference. Another director, Margaret Ellis, folded her hands. Limiting executive authority at this stage signals weakness to the market. Thomas finally spoke. Volatility signals weakness. The room fell quiet. Rebecca continued. Our condition for reinstating the first funding tranche remains unchanged. Independent oversight must be installed. Executive operational authority must be limited pending performance review. Governance restructuring must be formalized. Callista looked at me directly for the first time during the meeting. This is what you wanted. No, I answered calmly. This is what the clause required. I felt the weight of the shift then. The discussion was no longer about humiliation at a gala. It was about fiduciary responsibility attached to $2 billion in capital. The wine had started the conversation. The documentation was finishing it. The final board meeting took place 3 weeks after the gala. By then, the independent review had been circulated in full. No one raised their voice. The tension was controlled, almost clinical. Callista opened in the discussion. This company cannot function with divided authority. Investors need decisive leadership. Thomas responded without hesitation. Investors need reliable leadership. Margaret Ellis leaned forward. If we limit executive authority now, we risk signaling internal fracture. Daniel Cho countered. We already signaled fracture. The question is whether we correct it. I did not speak until invited. I had prepared a 12-slide stabilization framework outlining phased governance insulation, operational checks, and a 90-day review mechanism tied to tranche reinstatement milestones. Delaney, the chair prompted, walk us through your plan. I'm not requesting a role. I began. I'm outlining a structure that allows capital to deploy without exposure to further volatility. Callista's jaw tightened. This is an opportunistic power grab. It isn't, I answered calmly. If the board assigns someone else to execute it, the framework remains viable. Thomas looked at the directors. Funding resumes only if structural reform is adopted. Without reform, we withdraw the $2 billion in full. Silence followed. The numbers were not abstract. They represented research continuity, hiring plans, and contractual obligations already in motion. Margaret spoke again. If we accept these conditions, what happens to executive authority? Rebecca's voice came through the speakerphone. Operational authority transitions to an independent governance oversight committee pending performance review. The chair summarized the motion. The board moved Callista to the role of executive chair with non-operational duties, effectively stripping her of day-to-day control while preserving the founder image for the press. The governance oversight committee took the helm of the $2 billion deployment. The vote passed by a narrow margin. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Documents were circulated. Signatures followed. Callista remained seated longer than the others. As I gathered my notes, she looked at me steadily. You think this is leadership, she said quietly. I think it's accountability. I replied. By the end of the week, the investor reinstated the first funding tranche. Nothing outwardly dramatic changed, but authority had shifted in a way that did not require spectacle to be real. 6 months after the gala, the full $2 billion investment was deployed. The governance committee met weekly. Reporting lines were clearer. Decisions took longer, but they held. Our stock had recovered and moved above its pre-incident level. Analysts now used phrases like improved oversight instead of instability. Callista remained chief executive officer in title, but her role had shifted to advisory functions during the review period. We crossed paths in a hallway one afternoon after a strategy session. You look comfortable in that chair, she remarked, referring to the oversight seat I now occupied. It's not about comfort, I replied. It's about continuity. She studied me for a moment. You could have handled that night differently. I did handle it, I answered. Just not the way you expected. She gave a brief nod and walked on. It wasn't reconciliation, but it wasn't open hostility either. Power rarely ends with clean lines. Later that week, Thomas visited the office to finalize long-term capital deployment milestones. After the meeting, he asked to speak privately. You didn't react. He told me that you protected the structure. I protected the agreement. I corrected gently. That's leadership. He responded. I thought about that long after he left. I never set out to replace anyone. I set out to make sure that $2 billion didn't magnify a flaw we already knew existed. The lesson, if there is one, is simple. And not dramatic structure matters more than ego. Documentation matters. Calm decisions under pressure matter. Respect, once compromised publicly, becomes a financial variable whether we acknowledge it or not. That night at home, I replayed the moment in my mind one last time. She poured wine to remind me of my place. I reminded her who built the foundation. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, or subscribe. Conversations about leadership and accountability deserve more light than spectacle. I don't consider what happened a victory, that it was a correction. And sometimes, correction is enough. 30 seconds? That was how long it took for a $2.4 billion deal to begin collapsing. The wine was cold when it hit my face. I remember that clearly. It soaked into the collar of my blouse and ran down my neck while 200 people stood in a ballroom at the Langham in Chicago and watched. Claire Donovan held the empty glass in her hand. She had been smiling a moment earlier for photographers, and then she looked at me and said, "You don't belong in this circle." Her voice was steady. She believed it. No one stepped in. A few people gasped. Someone near the stage lowered a phone. The musicians stopped playing without meaning to. I did not answer her. I took a napkin from a passing tray and pressed it against my cheek. The room felt very still. I could see her father across the floor, frozen between anger and calculation. My name is Serafina Hale Whitlock. I am 52 years old. I had chosen to stand near the back of the ballroom that night. I was not on the program. I was not meant to speak. Officially. Whitlock Infrastructure Partners was represented by counsel and senior directors. That was how I preferred it. Claire assumed I was a consultant who had wandered too close to the center of attention. She mistook quiet for insignificance. It happens more often than people think. When I turned and walked toward the exit, no one tried to stop me. The carpet muffled my steps. My blouse clung to my skin. I felt the weight of their eyes on my back, but I kept moving. In the hallway outside the ballroom, my phone vibrated once with a missed call from Martin. The reply was simple. Review initiated. Executive suspension pending board confirmation. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen without opening anything. The suspension process had begun. Inside that ballroom, the presentation screen would freeze soon. The announcement would follow. 30 seconds is longer than it sounds when you are waiting for consequences to arrive. I slipped the phone back into my bag and walked toward the elevators, knowing that what happened in that room would not stay in that room, and that I would have to explain why I'd been there at all. I didn't reach for my phone right away. I waited until I felt steady. I knew once I sent it, I couldn't pretend it was just a bad moment. Then I typed initiate review under clause 14B. I didn't leave the hotel right away. I stepped into a quiet seating area near the elevators and called Martin Reyes, our general counsel. Is it done, I asked. It's in motion, he said. The board's emergency session is being assembled. You understand this won't stay quiet. It wasn't quiet inside either. I said. He paused. What exactly happened? The successor poured wine on me in front of investors. Another pause. Longer this time. In front of press, yes. That complicates things. It clarifies them. I said. Martin exhaled slowly. Serafina, if we suspend, Donovan Holdings will claim retaliation. They can claim what they want. Clause 14B doesn't require hurt feelings. It requires reputational risk. And you believe this qualifies. I don't believe it. I said. I watched it. Martin lowered his voice. For the record, you attended without identifying yourself. I wanted to observe them before final execution. You already control 53% through the Whitlock Trust. He said, you don't need observation. I need judgment. I replied, that was the truth. My ownership in Whitlock Infrastructure Partners runs through a family trust my father structured decades ago. Public filings list board members and managing directors. My name appears only where it must. I prefer it that way. Claire Donovan didn't know who you were, Martin said carefully. She knew how she treats people she thinks don't matter. That's different. No, I said. It isn't. He went quiet. I could hear papers shifting on his desk. If the board confirms suspension, this deal is effectively dead. Not dead. I corrected him. Under review. That's not how markets will read it. I looked back toward the ballroom doors. People were beginning to spill into the hallway, phones in hand. Martin, I said, I didn't go there to be seen. I know. I went there to see. He understood the difference. By the time I reached my car, Martin had sent the summary to the board. Clause 14B wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. It allowed executive suspension if a partner's conduct posed measurable reputational risk to a long-term infrastructure agreement. These projects span decades. Public trust matters. Martin called again. Serafina, Donovan's counsel is asking for clarification. He said, they're framing this as personal conflict. It isn't. I replied, it's governance. They'll argue the incident was social, not operational. It happened in front of investors during a signing ceremony for a $2.4 billion expansion. That's true. And Claire Donovan is the named successor in their governance filings. Yes, then it's operational. He let that settle. If the board confirms suspension, there's no reversing it quietly. I'm not asking for quiet. You understand this could cost both sides hundreds of millions in projected revenue. I understand. I said. I also understand what it costs to ignore warning signs. Silence again. You never intended to use this clause, Martin said finally. No, I answered. I intended never to need it. When the wine hit my face, the clause stopped being theoretical. I changed my blouse in the back seat before driving home. The smell of wine stayed on my skin even after I wiped it off. It brought back something I hadn't thought about in years. When I was 28, sitting in a project meeting on the South Side, a contractor once looked at me and said, "You're here for the presentation slides." "Right, I'm here to approve the budget." I told him. He laughed. Let the men handle that back then. I didn't control 53% of a firm. I didn't hold veto power. I was a junior executive trying to be heard in rooms where my presence was tolerated, not respected. Later that same year, another developer leaned across a table and said, "You're decorative. That's useful in negotiations." My father never attended those meetings. He believed in staying behind the structure he built. Let them underestimate you. He used to say, it makes decisions easier later. At 28, I thought that sounded like patience. Yos. At 52, I know it was strategy. I didn't answer him either. I wrote down his name and remembered it. Tonight felt similar, but different in one important way. Claire didn't insult me because she doubted my competence. She insulted me because she assumed I had none. Martin called again while I was stopped at a red light. The board vote is scheduled in 40 minutes, he said. Are they divided? I asked. Some are worried about optics. They should be worried about leadership. You're certain this isn't personal? I took a breath. It feels personal. That doesn't make it wrong. After I ended the call, I didn't start the engine. I sat there, my hands on the wheel, asking myself something I didn't like. Was I reacting to tonight? Or to every room I had ever walked into and been dismissed? I couldn't fully separate the two. That bothered me. The younger version of me would have swallowed the humiliation to keep momentum. I don't do that anymore. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. The river was quiet outside the windshield, and for a moment, I let myself think about the numbers. The Donovan expansion represented more than $2.4 billion in projected development. It would employ thousands of workers over the next decade. Subcontractors were already lining up. Municipal partnerships had been drafted. Suspension wouldn't just embarrass a family, it would rattle markets. Martin called as the board session began. You can still withdraw the request, he said. Once we vote, this moves beyond you. I know, I answered. There will be fallout. Investors will ask whether you acted emotionally. They already think I don't act at all, I said. That's not the same. No, I agreed. It isn't. There was a pause. I could hear other voices in the background, board members logging in. Serafina. Martin continued, lowering his voice. Is this about the wine? It's about judgment, I said. If Claire Donovan represents the future of that company, then tonight wasn't a social mistake. It was a preview. You're prepared for litigation threats, yes. For public criticism, yes. For the possibility that markets overreact. I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the contractors who would feel uncertainty in the morning. I thought about my own employees who trusted me to choose stable partners. I'm prepared, I said finally. Are they? He didn't respond to that. The board is asking for your formal position, he said instead. My position. I replied carefully. Is that if that's how she behaves when she feels secure? I don't want to see how she behaves under pressure. That's strong language. It's accurate. The vote began. Names were called. Positions recorded. When Martin returned to the line, his tone had shifted. The suspension is confirmed. I closed my eyes for a moment. The deal wasn't destroyed. It was frozen under governance review. That distinction mattered. That night, my older sister called. She had seen the news before I had time to explain it. Are you sure this wasn't pride? She asked gently. I don't think so, I said, but I can't pretend it didn't hurt. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, just make sure you can live with it 10 years from now. I lay awake longer than I expected after that. I kept replaying her question. Playing, not because I doubted the decision, but because I didn't want pride hiding inside it. I've seen leaders confuse ego for principle. I never wanted to be one of them. I watched it happen later that night on a recording Martin sent me. The ballroom feed cut between the stage and the presentation screen. Claire was smiling, pen in hand. Her father stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the table. The slide behind them read Final Execution. Then the screen froze. At first, people assumed it was technical. A few polite laughs. Someone from the production team stepped forward. A man in a gray suit approached the microphone. I recognized him as outside counsel assigned to the transaction. There has been a procedural development, he said, pursuant to Clause 14B. The agreement is suspended pending executive review. The room shifted. The tone changed. Claire lowered the pen. Suspended, she said, not into the microphone but close enough for it to catch. On what grounds? The attorney didn't look at her directly. Conduct concerns raised by the controlling partner. Her father leaned toward him. This is inappropriate, he said quietly but firmly. We have already announced this expansion publicly. The clause allows for temporary suspension before final execution, the attorney replied. The board has voted. You can't do this tonight, Donovan said. It has already been done. That was the moment his composure cracked. It wasn't anger. It was calculation unraveling. Phones began lighting up across the room. Investors stepped back from the tables, glancing down at alerts. One man near the front checked his screen and muttered, "Stocks moving." Claire scanned the ballroom as if searching for someone. I wasn't there. This is a misunderstanding, she said sharply, about who authorized this. The attorney answered carefully. The majority control holder? Her father's face went still. This is retaliation, Claire insisted. No, the attorney said. It's governance. There was no shouting after that, just movement, quiet exits. Conversations shifting in tone. The deal wasn't canceled in anger. It was frozen in procedure. But markets don't wait for explanations. By morning, the story had moved beyond the ballroom. I was in my office in the Loop when Martin walked in without knocking. He placed his tablet on my desk and turned it toward me. Opening bell just rang. He said, Donovan Holdings is down 17%. I nodded. Expected. It's accelerating. On the screen, financial networks replayed the suspension announcement. Then the video shifted. Someone had captured the wine incident from the side of the stage. It looped in silence. Martin watched my face. This is everywhere. I assumed it would be. The board at Donovan is demanding an internal review. They're questioning succession planning. That's their responsibility. He crossed his arms. They're implying your suspension triggered the drop. Their stock moved because investors saw instability. I said, not because of me. Claire Donovan is trending, he added. Commentary isn't kind. I leaned back in my chair. Public humiliation rarely is. A moment later, my phone rang. It was Eleanor Price, one of our independent directors. You've put us in the center of this, she said without greeting. We were already there, I replied. The media narrative suggests personal conflict. The board minutes reflect governance review. I said, stick to that. There was a pause. Do you regret suspending? No. Another pause. You realize Donovan may try to repair this. They're free to try. When I ended the call, I stood at the window and looked down at the river. Traffic moved as usual. Construction cranes were still visible in the distance. Martin spoke quietly behind me. You don't look pleased. I'm not, I said. I'm convinced. 2 senior managers stopped by my office that morning. They didn't challenge the decision, but they asked how long uncertainty would last. I realized then that strength at the top still feels like instability below. Claire Donovan had been positioned as the future of a $2.4 billion expansion. Overnight, she became a liability. Claire Donovan arrived without an appointment. My assistant stepped in first. She says it's urgent. Let her in, I said. Claire walked into my office without the confidence she had worn in the ballroom. No cameras, no audience. Her posture had changed. I didn't know who you were, she said before sitting down. I know, I replied. She swallowed. If I had known, I would have. That wasn't the problem. She looked at me carefully. Then what was... You treated someone you believed had no power as disposable. Her jaw tightened. I was under pressure. So am I. I said. Silence sat between us. The suspension is destroying my father's position, she said. The board is questioning succession. The board is questioning judgment. I corrected. She leaned forward. You could reverse it. You control the trust. I influence it. I said, I don't override governance for comfort. Her voice sharpened. This was personal. It stopped being private the moment the room went silent. She shook her head. It was a mistake. Her voice shook then, just slightly. I've never had something collapse because of me, she said. I didn't think it could. That was the first honest sentence she'd spoken. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I remembered being young and certain that rooms would bend around my ambition. They don't. They bend around consequence, like it was public, but I answered. And leadership mistakes at that level don't stay private. Her confidence flickered. What do you want? I want partners who understand responsibility. I can apologize, she said quickly. Publicly. This isn't about an apology. She exhaled slowly. Then what is it about? It's about whether I can attach my name to your leadership for the next 20 years. That landed harder than anything else. She stood after a moment. You're making an example of me. I'm evaluating risk. She looked smaller as she walked to the door. The board met again 3 days later to determine whether the suspension would convert to termination. Eleanor spoke first. Public sentiment is volatile. If we proceed, we look reactive. If we withdraw, we look punitive. We look consistent. I said, Martin reviewed the updated risk assessment. During the board discussion, one director spoke more sharply than the others. We're overreaching, he said. A social incident doesn't justify destabilizing a $2.4 billion agreement. I answered him directly. If it were social, it wouldn't have unfolded in front of investors and press. It wouldn't be affecting market confidence this morning. He didn't look convinced. But he didn't object again. Investor confidence in Donovan leadership has dropped significantly. Their internal restructuring is ongoing. Succession remains uncertain. One director asked me directly, be honest. Serafina, is this about the humiliation? No. I said, it's about exposure. Explain. Infrastructure projects run 20 to 30 years. I said, we tie our capital, our reputation, and public trust to leadership stability. What we saw wasn't a private lapse. It was a public display of poor judgment. Another voice came through the speaker. She's young. So was I replied. There was quiet after that. Eleanor leaned forward. If we terminate, Donovan Holdings will claim reputational harm. Like they already have reputational harm. But I said, we didn't create it. We observed it. The vote was closer this time. But it passed. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt responsibility. There's a difference, though people rarely notice it from the outside. Termination confirmed. No celebration followed. No relief either. When the meeting ended, Martin remained on the line. You're steady, he said. I'm clear, I answered. The wine didn't cause the decision. It just made it impossible to ignore. It was about whether I could responsibly bind a $2.4 billion, multi-decade commitment to leadership that had shown me who it was. 6 months later, we signed a new agreement with a Midwest consortium out of Minneapolis. Not everything remained intact. 2 municipal partners delayed smaller projects with us. They wanted distance from controversy, even if it wasn't theirs. I understood that. Martin handed me the final draft. No reputational flags when he said, board is aligned. Good, I replied. Let's proceed across the industry. Donovan Holdings announced internal restructuring. Claire stepped back from succession planning. Her father remained as interim executive. I didn't comment publicly. I didn't need to. Eleanor called that afternoon. Do you ever think about how differently this could have gone? Yes, I said, but different doesn't always mean better. She was quiet for a moment. You drew a hard line. I drew a necessary one. After we ended the call, I stood by the window in my office. Construction along the river continued as it always does. Projects move forward, leadership changes, decisions remain. I've learned that silence carries more weight than anger. When I was younger, I thought power meant being recognized. Now I think it means being able to walk away without raising your voice. You just have to decide what you're willing to stand beside. If someone shows you how they treat those they believe are beneath them, believe it. If you've ever had to choose between profit and principle, I hope you chose in a way you can live with. Power isn't about being seen. It's about deciding what you will not tolerate.